3 separate times in the last 20 years, a sovereign nation attempted to sell its oil in a currency other than the United States dollar. 3 separate times, those governments were erased from the map within 36 months. This isn't a conspiracy theory found on the fringes of the internet. It is a chronological timeline of cause and effect that has played out with mathematical precision since the turn of the millennium. We are looking at a mechanism that has a 100% success rate, a mechanism that has destroyed functioning economies, toppled entrenched dictators, and liquidated national reserves. The pattern is absolute, it is ruthless, and right now, in 2024, the exact same sequence is playing out again, but this time the scale is different. We aren't talking about a desert dictatorship or a Caribbean socialist state anymore. We are talking about the structural dismantling of the global financial order. The pattern has destroyed 3 entities in the last 2 decades, and right now, the United States economy is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, decision by decision, almost like we are reading from the same script that led to total collapse every single time before. Most people look at the wars in the Middle East or the poverty in South America and see chaos. They see random geopolitical events driven by religion or ideology or freedom. But if you look at the ledger, if you look at the banking data, the chaos vanishes and a perfect line appears. This is the story of how the petrodollar defends itself, why nations always think they can escape it, and why the math says we are currently standing on the precipice of the largest financial correction in human history. Let's go back to the blueprint, the original sin. The year is 2000. The location is Iraq. This is the clearest example of the pattern because it was the first time a modern petrostate dared to touch the third rail of American hegemony. Before 2000, Saddam Hussein was a problem, certainly, but he was a manageable problem. He was contained. However, in November of 2000, Iraq made a decision that signed its death warrant. Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would no longer accept US dollars for oil sold under the UN's Oil for Food program. He demanded payment in euros. At the time, this was laughed at. The euro was trading at around 82 cents to the dollar. Financial analysts in New York called it political posturing that would bankrupt Baghdad.
But then, the market moved. By 2002, the euro had appreciated nearly 30% against the dollar. Iraq was making a fortune. They were proving that a major OPEC producer could decouple from the dollar and actually become richer for it. This brings us to stage 1 of the pattern, the monetary rebellion. This is the trigger event. A resource-rich nation decides that the privilege of the US dollar is actually a tax they are no longer willing to pay. Almost immediately, we witnessed stage 2, the narrative shift. Prior to the euro switch, the media narrative around Iraq was focused on containment. Within months of the euro announcement, the narrative shifted to existential threat. We began hearing about weapons of mass destruction. We heard about aluminum tubes and yellow cake uranium. The intelligence agencies began pumping out reports that contradicted their own previous assessments. The drumbeat didn't start because of a sudden discovery of weapons. The timeline shows the drumbeat started when the currency peg was broken. Then came stage 3, financial excommunication. The US moved to isolate Iraq's banking sector, making it impossible for them to move these new euro profits easily. But it wasn't enough. The example was being set. If Iraq succeeded, others would follow. If OPEC switched to the euro, the demand for US dollars would evaporate and the American debt-based economy would implode. So we arrived at stage 4, kinetic intervention. In March 2003, the United States invaded. We all know the military outcome, shock and awe, the statue toppling in Firdo Square. But here is the data point that never makes the evening news. The fighting hadn't even stopped. The fires were still burning in the oil fields when the Coalition Provisional Authority signed Order 39. One of the very first legal acts of the US occupation was to switch the sale of Iraqi oil back from euros to US dollars. Mission accomplished. The euro threat was neutralized. The pattern was complete. 7 years later, the blueprint was dusted off again. The location? Libya. The time frame? 2011. This is perhaps the most tragic application of the pattern because Libya, by 2010, was arguably the most successful state in Africa. They had the highest human development index on the continent, free electricity, free healthcare, zero external debt, and $150 billion in foreign reserves.
Muammar Gaddafi, who had been rehabilitating his image with the West for years, made the fatal mistake. He initiated stage 1, the monetary rebellion. But he went further than Saddam. Gaddafi didn't just want to switch to the euro. He proposed the creation of the Gold Dinar. He planned to unite African nations and oil producers under a single currency backed by hard assets, gold. Libya possessed 144 tons of gold in its vaults. This was a direct threat not just to the US dollar, but to the French CFA franc, which dominated West African economies. A gold-backed currency in Africa would have shifted the entire economic balance of the hemisphere. It would have freed Africa from Western banking reliance. Watch how fast stage 2, the narrative shift, happened. In early 2011, protests broke out. Suddenly, the man who had been shaking hands with European leaders months prior was labeled a genocidal maniac. We were told he was giving Viagra to troops to commit mass rape, a claim that was later debunked by Amnesty International and the UN, but it didn't matter. The narrative was set. Stage 3, financial excommunication, was swift. The US and EU froze nearly $100 billion in Libyan assets. But you can't freeze physical gold sitting in a vault in Tripoli. That requires boots on the ground. So, stage 4, kinetic intervention. NATO launched a bombing campaign under the guise of a no-fly zone. But looking at the targeting data, they didn't just target anti-aircraft batteries. They targeted the infrastructure of the state. In October 2011, Gaddafi was captured and executed. The result? The Gold Dinar proposal vanished instantly. The 144 tons of gold, much of it unaccounted for in the chaos. Libya went from the wealthiest nation in Africa to a failed state with open slave markets in less than a year. The threat to the dollar system was eliminated. The oil flowed, and it flowed in dollars. Then we have the third case study, Venezuela, 2017 to present. This is the modern iteration of the pattern, showing how the tactics have evolved from direct invasion to economic siege warfare. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. Under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, the country was a thorn in Washington's side, but the red line was crossed in September 2017. Venezuela announced it would stop accepting US dollars for oil payments. They began pricing oil in Chinese yuan and launched a state-backed cryptocurrency, the Petro, explicitly designed to bypass US sanctions and the SWIFT banking system. Stage 1, monetary rebellion. Check. Stage 2, the narrative shift. The US declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security. Now, the mismanagement of the Venezuelan economy by Maduro is undeniable, but the external pressure applied was calculated to induce total collapse. Stage 3, financial excommunication.
This was the most brutal application of this stage in history. The US didn't just freeze assets, they seized them. They confiscated Citgo, Venezuela's refining arm in the US. The Bank of England froze $1 billion of Venezuelan gold and refused to give it back. The sanctions effectively cut Venezuela off from the global financial system entirely. We didn't see a full-scale Stage 4 invasion, but we saw the 21st century equivalent, an attempted coup, funded and recognized by the West, recognizing Juan Guaido as president, a man who had never been elected to the presidency. We saw mercenaries arrested on beaches. We saw cyber attacks on the power grid. The result? The Venezuelan economy contracted by 80%. Inflation hit 1 million %. The country was effectively destroyed without a single US Marine officially crossing the border. The message was sent to the rest of Latin America. Try to leave the dollar system. Try to build an alternative financial architecture, and we will turn your country into a parking lot, financially speaking. 3 countries, 3 attempts to leave the dollar, 3 collapsed states. The pattern is perfect. But here is where the story changes. Here is where the math stops working in America's favor. For the last 20 years, the US could pick off these nations one by one. Iraq was isolated. Libya was isolated. Venezuela was isolated. They were lone wolves trying to fight a pack. But today, right now, we are witnessing the formation of a pack that is bigger than the US. We are currently deep inside this pattern with the BRICS alliance, specifically involving Russia, China, and Iran. But the variable that changes everything, the variable that should terrify anyone holding US assets, is Saudi Arabia. Let's run the current situation through the framework. Stage 1, monetary rebellion.
Saudi Arabia, the keystone of the petrodollar system, the country that struck the deal in 1974 to price oil exclusively in dollars, is now openly trading oil in yuan. The petro-yuan is no longer a theory, it is a reality. In 2023, 20% of global oil was bought and sold in non-dollar currencies. The rebellion isn't just one rogue nation, it is the entire producer bloc. Check. Stage 2, the narrative shift. Look at the headlines regarding Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He went from being a reformist darling to a pariah, Joe Biden's exact word, very quickly. We see the same language used against Russia and China, axis of evil, existential threats, enemies of democracy. The labeling is in full effect. Check. Stage 3, financial excommunication. The US weaponized the SWIFT system against Russia in 2022. They seized $300 billion in sovereign assets. This was meant to be the death blow, the stage 3 that killed the rebellion. But it failed. The Russian ruble bounced back. The Russian economy grew faster than the German economy in 2023. Why? Because the rebellion is now too big to sanction. You cannot sanction the entire world's manufacturing base, China, and the world's energy station, Russia, simultaneously without destroying yourself. We are now hovering at the edge of stage 4, but this time, kinetic intervention means World War III. You cannot invade China. You cannot execute a regime change in Moscow without risking nuclear annihilation. The mechanism that destroyed Iraq and Libya is jammed. The gears are grinding. This is the terrifying part. When a system that relies on total dominance to survive suddenly loses that dominance, it doesn't slowly decline. It snaps. The US debt sits at $34 trillion. The only reason this debt is sustainable is that the world must hold dollars to buy oil. If the world can buy oil in yuan or gold or rupees, those trillions of dollars currently held abroad will come flooding back home. Imagine a dam breaking. That is the US economy if the petrodollar dies. We are seeing the early warning signs of stage 5, but this time the reset isn't happening to the country trying to leave the dollar, it's happening to the dollar itself.
We are seeing central banks buying gold at the fastest pace in history, 1,037 tons in a single year. They are dumping treasuries. They are reading the same pattern we are, and they are heading for the exit.
The exceptionalism argument is the most dangerous drug on the market. It can't happen to the dollar. We are the United States. That is exactly what the British said about the pound sterling in 1920. It's what the Dutch said about the guilder in the 1700s. Every reserve currency has a lifespan. The average is about 94 years. The US dollar has been the reserve currency for roughly 100 years. We are on borrowed time. The historical evidence is clear. When a country tries to leave the American financial orbit, the empire strikes back. It happened 3 times with absolute brutality. But now, the empire is swinging at a target it cannot knock down. And when you swing at a giant and miss, the momentum carries you off the cliff. The pattern says we are next. Not for an invasion, but for a currency crisis that will make 2008 look like a picnic. The stages are completing. The rebellion is widespread. The narrative is hostile. The sanctions have failed. The kinetic option is off the table. There is only one move left on the board. Understanding this pattern is the difference between being a victim of history and a survivor of it. The shift is already happening. The only question is whether you're watching the distraction or watching the money.